Okay, so in this video, we are going to define exposure and what it is, take a look at how the camera is built, because I think that's very important when it comes to learning how to control your camera, and ultimately figuring out how do you control the amount of light that gets into your camera, because that is basically what you're doing all the time. And then I'm going to go into breaking down what we call the exposure triangle. I'm really going to try to focus mostly on light in this video because that's really where we need to start. And then we'll talk about the exposure triangle a little bit more later and what other ways you can control creatively as far as your final image is concerned. So I am going to make this bigger for you. Okay, so exposure in photography is pretty much defined as the amount of light collected by your camera sensor. And so what does your camera have to do? How many mechanisms does the light have to go through until it gets to your camera sensor? And it's really kind of crazy once you start learning about it. So the lens, first the light is going to enter through the camera lens, and then the lens focuses on that light. Then the light passes through the aperture, which is the adjustable opening inside of that lens. And after that, the shutter opens and closes to control how long that light is allowed to hit the sensor. So if you could imagine, if that shutter is open for a long amount of time, there's more light hitting that sensor. That's a brighter image. And if the shutter closes really quickly, less light, so darker image. We'll talk more about that later. So after the shutter opens and closes, controls how long the light is allowed to hit the sensor, and then the image sensor records that image. And I'll talk about some different types of cameras when it comes to that in just a second. So every photo that you take is controlled by three major settings. That is your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. So what are those things? Your aperture controls how much light enters through the lens. Your shutter speed controls how long that light is allowed to enter in through the camera. And then your ISO is just controlling how sensitive your camera sensor is to that light. So that is that's really basically what you're doing. But I feel like to better understand that, let's go inside the camera a little bit. So now let me just go ahead and note that this is a diagram of a DSLR image. So this is a little bit different than the more popular cameras now. Obviously technology is constantly changing and getting better, and so we have cameras called mirrorless. So first let me kind of explain what this image is, and then I'll explain what that means. Okay, so here's the diagram here. Here's the light entering through the camera. And then you'll see that it's going to enter through, so this is a DSLR. Sorry, I'm thinking of mirrorless right now. So entering through the lens here, and then there's multiple glass elements that focus and redirect the light towards the sensor. So number 5 here is your, or number 6 is your digital sensor right here. We're going to talk more about that in just a second. So the aperture right here is kind of acting as like the pupil of your eye. So just think about your eyes for a second, your iris. In bright environments, your pupil gets smaller to reduce the amount of light that comes in, right? And then in darker environments, your pupil opens wider to allow more light in. That camera aperture right here acts the very same way. Again, we're going to talk more about that in just a second. I'm going to break those apart in just a minute. So when you press that shutter button up here towards the top, the things that happen are, in a camera with mirror mechanisms, the mirror flips up, the shutter opens, light reaches that image sensor here, and then the shutter closes. So that image is then recorded. And all of that happens in just a fraction of a second. And so it's really, really crazy. But you are able to control, how quickly that happens and everything once we get to where we want to be as in photography. So think of your sensor right here as basically the digital replacement for what used to be film. So instead of using chemicals like we used to do to expose and produce images, those digital sensors are now collecting that light electronically. So your sensor actually contains millions of tiny little pixels. They're light sensitive pixels, so each one of those little bitty squares are capturing what you're telling it to capture. So every pixel records brightness and color information. So that's very important to remember. So let me just go back for a second. So again, this is a DSLR. You've probably heard the term mirrorless cameras. So mirrorless basically, or EVF. So basically what that is that has gotten rid of all the mirror mechanisms in the camera and replaced them to send those signals electronically without those mirrors. And so it's sending it electronically to your viewfinder, or how you look at your image, and then also to the sensor and the viewfinder, obviously. So it's just, so you see how the mirrors here are redirecting all the light so that you can look through the viewfinder and see what you're trying to take a picture of. So now what's happening is basically it's replaced with a very small TV instead of that mirrored image. And without getting in too technical in that, that's basically what that technology is. Okay, so just a quick example of underexposed, correctly exposed, and overexposed images, where you're going to see or hear me talk about that a lot. Usually our goal is to get a correctly exposed image. Now that does depend on what you're trying to achieve. Some people do like slightly overexposed images or even slightly underexposed images. But really the goal is to get a correctly exposed image because you are able to edit that image later. So if you did want to brighten it or darken it, it's better to have a correctly exposed image to work with first. So basically underexposed image is missing a little bit of information. So in the darkest pixels, if you increase the exposure post-processing, you could find some noise. So again, it is better to your goal to be a correctly exposed image. So basically underexposed, not enough light getting in the camera, correctly perfect amount, trying to recreate exactly what your eyes are seeing, and then overexposed, too much light just hitting the sensor, basically. Okay, so let's break this down, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. We're going to start with aperture here. So aperture is going to be, and you can kind of look through, if you have a camera, you can kind of look through there, and sometimes you can kind of see what looks like this little shutter here. That's what this looks like. So you can control this aperture, how big it is or how small it is. So again, this is kind of mimicking your eyes and your pupils. So all I want you to remember right now about aperture is these examples here. So they are on your camera, you'll see them noted as F and then a number. They're f stops. So lower numbers, f1.4 would be wide open, and then f16 would be extremely small. So how does that affect light? Obviously, if you have a smaller one, less light is allowed to come through, and if you have a larger opening, more light is going to come through. Here are some very basic examples of what you would get as far as your lighting is concerned when that aperture is low or high as far as the numbers go. Now that is very confusing for a lot of people in the beginning because more light would be a higher number, or the opening would be larger, but the number is smaller. So that's the confusing part. Again, down here, number is larger, but the opening is smaller. So that is one of the things I found that some people get a little bit confused. And we're going to go back and we're going to really break these things apart right now. Like I said, I'm just talking about light for the most part, but you do need to go ahead and note or remember that aperture is affecting two things. It's affecting the exposure, or the light that is allowed to come into the camera, and it's also affecting your depth of field. So what does that mean? Your depth of field refers to how much of the image appears sharp and in focus. So if you think about those really professional looking images where the background is really nice and blurred, but the subject is perfectly in focus, that is controlled with your aperture. So let's move on to shutter speed. Really fun one. Shutter speed is going to control how long your camera sensor is exposed to that light, and it's done by your actual shutter is, think of it like a curtain that opens and closes inside the camera. In fact, it kind of does look like blinds going up and down the way it's made. So a fast shutter speed is going to expose that sensor for a short amount of time. And then a slow shutter speed exposes the sensor for a longer amount of time. And these are shown as seconds or fractions of a second. You see over here, 2, that's actually indicating 2 entire seconds, 1 second, and then 1/1000th of a second. So these are fractions of a second that we're dealing with. So again, we've got a nice diagram down here that shows you if you were to set your camera with a very fast shutter speed, 1/2000th of a second, that shutter is opening and closing super duper quick. So not a lot of light is allowed into the camera, resulting in a darker image. And then the opposite is true over here. Now, if you go outside and you set your shutter for 1 second outside on a sunny day, you're probably going to get an entire white image, possibly, because that is just way too much light entering and hitting that sensor. So you usually on, even night, or when we get into like light writing and things like that we'll get into later, that's when we're going to be going up into those actual 1 to 2, 3 seconds, things like that. So there's, again, just like with aperture, with shutter speed, you're controlling the amount of light that goes in the camera. Another thing that you're controlling with shutter speed is you're thinking about motion. So think about those images where you may have captured someone running and they're very, very blurred. That's because that shutter was open for a little bit more time, and it just captured more of that motion. So that's the kind of the creative aspect that you have to think about when you are choosing your shutter speed. So a slow shutter speed is going to capture more of a motion blur, but a quick shutter speed will capture someone. It will freeze that motion a little bit better. So someone jumping up in the air, you need a very fast shutter speed to capture that. Even when you're talking about like water, taking pictures of running water and stuff like that, if you want to soften that water up and make it look really smooth, you're going to need a little bit longer of a shutter speed. And if you want to really freeze capturing that water, you need a quicker shutter speed. So the last part of the exposure triangle that we're going to talk about here is the ISO. So the ISO is really controlling how sensitive your camera is to light. It really just controls that camera sensor. So the ISO, you will see anywhere from 100 all the way to 6400 usually on your camera. It's going to depend, your camera's going to, depending on what type of camera you have, is going to depend on what numbers you're going to be seeing here. Some don't go up this high. So again, a low ISO is going to result in a darker image, and then a higher ISO is going to result in a lighter image or more light hitting that sensor. No, let me go back and say that again. It's not the light hitting the sensor. It's actually your camera controlling how sensitive that sensor is what ISO is going to control. So in addition to that, ISO also kind of creates what we call some image noise. So you want to usually try to get the lowest ISO that you can depending on the light that you're working with, because the higher your ISO, the more likely your image is going to look grainy and kind of almost like speckled. So we usually want to avoid that. Again, some photographers, you want to be super creative and that's kind of the look you want to go for, then that's kind of how you control that. So with all of that being said, you have to kind of remember that every exposure decision is kind of a balancing act. So it can be confusing in the beginning. So for example, if you really want to blur out that background, you would definitely want to go ahead and set your aperture to a low aperture number, and that's allowing a lot of light into the camera. But then you might have to balance that out by adjusting your shutter speed to make sure that that image is not too bright. And then same thing with ISO, it's a balancing act. And we'll get more into that later, but we really just want to right now define what all this means, how your camera's capturing that light, and how you can control that with just 3 of the pieces of the exposure triangle.